What would you do if a peaceful first-class flight turned into a scene you'd never forget? If a stranger's temper crossed the line right in front of you and the one person who could stop it was sitting behind the locked cockpit door on Flight 482 to Denver, 16-year-old Jordan Ellison thought his biggest challenge would be finishing his homework before landing. But when a wealthy, entitled passenger set her sights on him, the tension in the cabin began to boil. Words turned sharp, glances turned cold, until one moment shattered the fragile calm. A single act of aggression stopped time in its tracks. But this was no ordinary passenger Jordan was dealing with. His father, Captain Marcus Ellison, wasn't just flying the plane he was about to land more than an aircraft. In the hours that followed, every person on board would witness a lesson in quiet authority, respect, and the cost of crossing a line you can never uncross. What happened in that cabin? Why did it spark conversations long after the seatbelt sign went off? And what did it reveal about the power of dignity under pressure? Stay tuned, and before we take off, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss a story that moves you. The sound came first, a sharp, clean crack that sliced through the low hum of the engines and the muted clink of glassware in the first-class cabin. For half a second, no one seemed to breathe. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. 16-year-old Jordan Ellison sat motionless in seat 3A, his back pressed into the soft leather, his eyes wide with shock. A crimson handprint bloomed across his right cheek, bright against his warm brown skin. Standing over him, frozen in place, was Samantha Hayes. Her own hand hovered in the air, fingers trembling as though they couldn't quite believe what they'd just done. Her uniform blazer was neat, her hair perfectly pinned, but her face was pale, almost as if the blood had drained away all at once. 24 passengers in first class stared in silence. A businessman in 2C slowly lowered his glass of bourbon. A woman in 1B clutched her pearl necklace as if she'd just witnessed a crime. Jordan blinked once, twice, his lips parted. "I didn't," he began, his voice low, tentative, almost pleading. But Samantha cut him off before he could finish, her own voice shaking, pitched just above a whisper, but sharp enough to carry through the cabin. "I don't care who you think you are. You don't belong up here." The words seemed to hang in the air like turbulence that never ends. And then, from somewhere above their heads, the overhead speakers crackled to life. "This is Captain Marcus Ellison speaking." His voice was deep, resonant, and unmistakably controlled. But there was a hard edge beneath the calm, an edge anyone who knew him would recognize as danger. "Flight Attendant Samantha Hayes," he said slowly, "please report to the cockpit immediately." There was a pause. The pause stretched just long enough for every passenger to know this was not a routine summons. Then he added, with deliberate weight, "That's my son you just struck." Samantha's eyes widened, but she didn't move. The entire cabin seemed suspended in the moment. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her wrists, in her fingertips that still stung from the contact. Her breath caught as every gaze pinned her in place judgment. Confusion, even a hint of fear reflected back at her. In the window seat, Jordan didn't speak. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, his chest rising and falling with the kind of deep, deliberate breaths you take when you're trying not to cry. Across the aisle in 3C, Cathy Whitmore was smiling. Not a warm smile. Not the kind you share with strangers. It was the kind of smile that said she just won something. Samantha saw it and felt a twist in her stomach. The heat of humiliation crawled up her neck. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the reality was setting in 19 years in the air, countless flights without a single incident like this, and now This, she knew every passenger was thinking the same thing. What could possibly have led to this? How does a veteran flight attendant lose control so completely? Right here, in front of everyone. Samantha knew the answer was complicated, but she also knew there was no undoing what had just happened. For a moment, she thought about walking straight to the cockpit as ordered, but her feet stayed rooted to the aisle carpet, as if she could delay the inevitable by refusing to move. Then she felt a gentle touch on her elbow. Paula Moreno, the lead flight attendant, was suddenly there at her side, her eyes calm but urgent. "Sam," she murmured. "Go. I'll stay with him." Samantha looked at Paula's face, searching for judgment and finding only a quiet steadiness. She nodded, her throat tight, and turned toward the front of the cabin. As she moved up the aisle, she passed rows of wide-eyed passengers who tried and failed to hide their curiosity. Some leaned back in their seats as if to make space for her to walk by. Others just followed her with their eyes. Her polished shoes made almost no sound on the carpet, but every step felt heavier than the last. She reached the forward galley, her fingers brushing against the edge of the service counter for balance. She stopped in front of the cockpit door. For a moment, she thought about the captain's voice, firm, precise, the same voice he'd used in pre-flight briefings. She'd flown with Marcus Ellison before. He was professional to the point of formality, a man who spoke little but observed everything. He'd always treated his crew with respect, but there was a distance there too, a line you didn't cross. Now she had crossed it, not just with him, but with his son. Her hand hovered over the small panel beside the door. The hum of the engines filled the silence around her. She pressed the call button. The door unlocked with a quiet click, and she stepped inside. The cockpit was brightly lit, a contrast to the warm dimness of the cabin. Captain Ellison sat in the left seat, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes on the instrument panel as he completed a post-landing checklist. Beside him, the first officer glanced at her briefly before looking away, his expression carefully neutral. Samantha swallowed hard. "Captain," she began, but her voice trailed off. He didn't turn right away. He flipped a switch, signed a document on his clipboard, and only then did he swivel his chair to face her. The look in his eyes made her chest tighten. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder, sharper. "Can you explain," he said evenly, "why my 16-year-old son has your handprint on his face?" Samantha opened her mouth, but no words came. How could she explain the perfect storm of exhaustion, pressure, and simmering injustice that had led to that one irreversible moment? How could she justify something she knew had no justification? She thought about telling him the whole story, the remarks from Cathy Whitmore, the way Jordan had kept his head down, the echo of her own daughter's face in his silence. She thought about telling him how her life outside of work felt like it was collapsing, how she'd been holding herself together with nothing but fraying string. But none of that mattered now. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I lost control." Marcus Ellison didn't respond right away. His jaw flexed once. Then he said, "We'll talk after everyone's off the plane." She nodded, the weight of his gaze following her as she stepped backward into the galley again, the hum of the engine suddenly louder than before. Somewhere in the cabin, Jordan Ellison was still sitting in seat 3A, the red mark on his cheek slowly fading, but the memory of it already carved into the moment. And somewhere inside Samantha Hayes, a truth had already settled in no matter how the rest of this day played out. Her life had just changed. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the very start of this flight, less than an hour ago, when the jet bridge door first closed on Coastline Airways Flight 482 from New York to Los Angeles. The alarm on Samantha Hayes' phone went off at 3:45. The tinny chime far too bright for the darkness that filled her Brooklyn apartment. She reached out from beneath the blanket, fumbling for the phone on the nightstand. The cold air hit her arm, making her shiver. She lay still for a moment, staring at the hairline crack in her bedroom ceiling, wishing for just 10 more minutes. But flight schedules didn't bend for exhaustion, and today's trip from JFK to Los Angeles was a long one. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, rubbing her eyes until the room came into focus. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette. A single mug sat in the sink from last night's tea. On the table lay a stack of envelopes bills she hadn't opened yet. Rent was due in 4 days. The balance in her checking account was already dangerously low. She padded into the bathroom, turned on the light, and caught her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles bloomed under her hazel eyes. A faint crease etched permanently between her brows. She pulled her hair into a low bun, securing it with the same practiced twist she'd done thousands of times before. In the kitchen, she made coffee strong, no sugar, and sipped it while staring at the city lights flickering outside her window. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was from her ex-husband. "Brian. Can't send the support payment this month. Things are tight. We'll make it up to you next time." Her thumb hovered over the screen. She could have sent a dozen replies, angry, pleading, sarcastic. Instead, she set the phone down and finished her coffee in silence. Brian's version of tight meant a delayed client payment or an unexpected golf trip. For her, it meant calculating whether she could pay both rent and utilities or just one. By 4:20, she was out the door, her rolling suitcase bumping against the concrete steps as she descended to the street. The early air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of the East River. The city was quiet at this hour, except for the occasional taxi sliding past. The ride to JFK took 40 minutes. She sat in the back of the cab, watching the skyline fade into the low industrial sprawl of Queens. She thought about her daughter, Chloe, who was spending the week with Brian. 9 years old and already more perceptive than most adults. Chloe would have noticed the tension in her mother's voice, the way her smile didn't always reach her eyes. Inside Terminal 8, Samantha swiped her ID at the crew security checkpoint. "Morning. Hayes," the TSA officer said, barely glancing up from his screen. "Morning," she replied, her voice automatic. The crew lounge was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, the scent that clung to every corner of her career. Paula Moreno was already there, seated at a table with her tablet open, reviewing the passenger manifest. Paula looked up, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "You look like you could use a gallon of coffee," Paula said. "I've already had 2 cups," Samantha replied, forcing a smile of her own. Paula was the kind of colleague who could read a room in a heartbeat. In her late 50s, she had the calm authority of someone who had seen it all: turbulence, medical emergencies, mid-air disputes. She had been a mentor to Samantha since her early days at Coastline Airways. "Captain Ellison today," Paula said, tapping the manifest. "You've flown with him before, right? Once or twice," Samantha answered. "Professional? Keeps to himself." Paula's eyes softened. "His son's on the flight. 16. Traveling with him to California. Smart kid from what I've heard." Samantha nodded. She remembered Marcus Ellison as a man of precision every checklist completed to the letter, every announcement measured and clear. She imagined his son would be similar. They chatted briefly about the flight schedule before moving toward the gate. The terminal was waking up now, its glass walls reflecting the pale light of early morning. Travelers wheeled luggage in steady lines, their voices a low murmur beneath the occasional boarding call. At Gate 42, the Boeing 787 gleamed under the floodlights, its white fuselage and blue tail a familiar sight. Samantha felt the same small pull she always did before a long-haul flight, a mix of anticipation and the quiet wish that nothing unusual would happen. She stowed her suitcase in the forward crew closet and began her routine checking emergency equipment, confirming catering deliveries, adjusting headsets in the galley. Paula appeared beside her with a quiet chuckle. "We've got Cathy Whitmore in 2C, she said. Samantha glanced up. "That name should mean something to me." Paula grinned. "You'll remember by the end of the flight. She's particular." Particular in crew speak often meant demanding to the point of hostility. Samantha had dealt with her share of difficult passengers over 19 years, but the warning still lodged somewhere in her mind. "Let's just keep things smooth," Samantha said, checking the coffee pots. The jet bridge door opened to the first trickle of passengers, business travelers with phones in their hands, couples whispering about vacation plans. Samantha stood at the door with Paula, offering practiced greetings as each person boarded. And then he appeared. Jordan Ellison stepped into the cabin behind his father. Tall for his age, lean, his posture polite but guarded. He wore a navy sweater over a crisp white shirt, jeans pressed enough to suggest someone cared about presentation. "Morning." "Samantha," Captain Ellison said with a curt nod before continuing toward the cockpit. "Morning, Captain," she replied, then looked at Jordan. "Welcome aboard." He met her eyes briefly and gave a small, respectful nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Samantha watched him walk to seat 3A, place his backpack under the seat, and pull out a thick book on astrophysics. He opened it as if he'd been reading it for hours already. From the corner of her eye, Samantha caught movement. Cathy Whitmore was stepping onto the plane. The click of her heels on the jet bridge floor was sharp, deliberate. She wore a tailored gray suit, a silk scarf knotted at her throat, and a look that said the cabin existed for her convenience alone. "Welcome back, Ms. Whitmore," Paula said smoothly, recognizing her from previous flights. "Good morning," Cathy replied, her voice warm in a way that somehow felt rehearsed. She swept her gaze over the cabin, pausing just a moment too long on Jordan before moving toward her seat in 2C. Samantha felt something shift in the air. It was subtle, but after years in the job, she knew when personalities in first class might collide. She filed it away, returning to the steady rhythm of boarding. By the time the last passenger was seated and the jet bridge pulled away, Samantha had slipped fully into her professional mode. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet boy in 3A and the poised woman in 2C were going to cross paths in a way that would demand her attention. Marcus Ellison had been flying for so many years that the cockpit felt more like home than his own apartment in Chicago. The way his hands moved across the instrument panel was second nature, as automatic as breathing. From the moment he'd first stepped into a flight simulator at 21, he'd known the sky was where he belonged. Now, at 46, with over 2 decades as a commercial pilot and 8 years in the captain's seat for Coastline Airways, he had earned a reputation for precision. Colleagues said he was unshakable under pressure, the kind of man who could land in crosswinds without breaking a sweat. But today was different. Not because of the flight plan from New York to Los Angeles, that was a familiar route. It was different because of the boy sitting in 3A. Jordan, his only son, 16 years old, curious and thoughtful, with a mind that soaked up information like a sponge. Marcus had seen himself in Jordan since the day the boy was born. The same careful observation of the world, the same tendency to pause before speaking. Marcus had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't often that Jordan's school schedule aligned with his own layovers. They had planned to spend a couple of days in California, touring Caltech, one of Jordan's dream schools. For Marcus, it was more than just a father-son trip. It was a chance to have time together without the usual distractions. No rushing between school and work, no phone calls cutting conversations short, just uninterrupted hours to talk. As the final passengers boarded, Marcus glanced at the monitor showing the cabin view. He saw Jordan in his seat, head bent over a thick book, oblivious to the bustle around him. A small smile touched Marcus's face. In the galley, Samantha Hayes moved with practiced efficiency, checking coffee carafes and securing galley carts. Marcus had flown with her twice before. She was competent, professional, and steady a flight attendant who didn't flinch when passengers became difficult. He didn't know much about her personal life, but something about the way she carried herself suggested she'd weathered more than her share of storms. Jordan, for his part, had been excited about the flight not for the destination, but for the fact that it was on a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of his favorite aircraft. He'd read about its composite structure, fuel efficiency, and advanced aerodynamics. Now, he had a window seat where he could watch the wing flex in real time. He had packed light a single backpack with a change of clothes, a tablet, and 2 books. One was on astrophysics, the other a worn copy of Ender's Game that he'd read at least 3 times. Jordan wasn't the kind of teenager who spent his time scrolling endlessly on his phone. He preferred to observe, to listen. That trait sometimes made him seem distant to others, but those who knew him understood that he was simply processing the world in his own deliberate way. As boarding wrapped up, Marcus leaned back in the captain's chair. Ready, he asked his first officer, a young pilot named Derek Ross. "All set," Derek replied, running his finger down the checklist. Marcus made the announcement to the passengers calm, measured, just enough warmth to put people at ease. He didn't mention that his son was on board. Marcus wasn't one for making personal details public. In the cabin, Jordan adjusted his seatbelt as the plane began to push back from the gate. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Cathy Whitmore in 2C watching him. Not in a friendly, curious way, more like she was evaluating him, the way someone might inspect an unfamiliar object. He turned his attention back to his book, but he felt the weight of her gaze linger for several seconds before she shifted in her seat. Jordan had dealt with people like her before. Not often, but enough to recognize the signs. The subtle narrowing of the eyes, the faint lift of the chin. It wasn't always about race, but sometimes it was, and even when it wasn't, it still carried the same uncomfortable edge. For now, he decided to ignore it. This was supposed to be a good trip. He wasn't going to let one passenger ruin it. As the aircraft taxied, Samantha moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. She paused briefly at Jordan's row. "You good here?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am," he said, giving a small nod. She smiled faintly, then continued toward the back. Jordan noticed that she didn't look rushed or impatient like some crew members he'd seen before. There was a steadiness in her movements, as if she made a point of giving each passenger a moment of her attention. The takeoff was smooth, the kind that Marcus prided himself on. Once they reached cruising altitude, the cabin lights softened and the first-class service began. Jordan took out his earbuds, listening to soft piano music while he read. Every so often, he glanced out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, the sunlight turning their tops gold. From his seat, he could hear Cathy's voice. It carried that particular tone, half complaint, half performance. She was talking to Samantha about the wine selection, about how the last time she flew first class, the service was impeccable and unlike what she'd seen lately. Jordan kept his head down, but he caught a word here and there. He heard her mention standards and expectations and the way things used to be. He wasn't sure if she meant to be overheard, but something told him she didn't care either way. In the cockpit, Marcus glanced at the cabin camera feed again. Jordan was still in his seat, focused on his book. That was a relief. Marcus didn't like to interfere with cabin matters unless necessary, but he trusted Paula and Samantha to handle any issues. Still, there was a part of him, small but persistent, that was aware of how quickly things could shift on a flight. He'd seen calm flights turn tense in seconds, sometimes over something as small as a spilled drink. For now, though, everything seemed normal. In the galley. Samantha refilled coffee cups and brought out warm towels for the first-class passengers. When she reached Jordan, he thanked her quietly. Cathy watched the exchange, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't say anything, but Samantha felt the tension ripple in the air like static. She told herself it was nothing, just another passenger with a sharp edge. She'd dealt with worse, but as she moved down the aisle, she couldn't shake the sense that this was the beginning of something, a thread that, if pulled, might unravel the entire flight. The first hour of the flight passed in an easy rhythm. The faint hiss of the air system filled the background as passengers settled into their seats, unwrapping blankets, adjusting screens, and sipping their first drinks. Jordan kept his attention on his book, though the words began to blur as the steady vibration of the aircraft lulled him into that peaceful space between focus and daydream. Every so often, he glanced out at the sunlit clouds, their white edges glowing against a deep blue sky. Samantha moved quietly through the cabin, offering refills and snacks with a professional smile. She had that careful balance every good flight attendant mastered: present enough to be helpful, but never hovering. It might have stayed that way, uneventful and smooth, if not for the sound of Cathy Whitmore's voice. "Excuse me," Cathy said, flagging Samantha as she passed. "This seat feels off." Samantha leaned in slightly. "Off in what way, Ms. Whitmore?" "The recline," Cathy said, gesturing with a perfectly manicured hand. "It doesn't go back as far as the one on my last flight. I paid for comfort, and I expect the product I purchased." "I'll check the mechanism," Samantha replied, pressing the button on the side of Cathy's seat. The seat back moved smoothly. "It seems to be working, but I'll make a note in our report so maintenance can double-check after we land." Cathy exhaled through her nose in a way that made the words unnecessary. It was clear she didn't believe the answer. Jordan heard the entire exchange without looking up from his book. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Cathy's voice carried just enough to cross the aisle. Moments later, as Samantha walked away, Cathy shifted in her seat and leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward him. "That's quite a book for someone your age," she said, her tone somewhere between polite interest and veiled condescension. Jordan looked up. "I like space science," he said simply. Her smile was faint, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be very bright. Where are your parents?" "My dad's flying the plane," Jordan replied, his voice even. That seemed to surprise her. "Your father is the captain." "Yes, ma'am." Cathy's eyes flickered in a way Jordan couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part something sharper. "Well," she said after a pause, "I suppose that explains why you're up here." Jordan didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than any reply. He turned back to his book, feeling the first faint twist of discomfort in his stomach. Samantha, making her way back down the aisle, caught the tail end of Cathy's comment. She didn't react outwardly, but she noted the tone. She'd been in the business long enough to recognize when a remark wasn't as harmless as it pretended to be. She made a mental note to keep an eye on 2C. In the cockpit, Marcus was listening to the chatter between air traffic control and other flights in the area. His mind split between maintaining the course and thinking about Jordan. He pictured his son in 3A, probably buried in a book, and felt that quiet pride he always did. He didn't know that the first small spark between Jordan and Cathy had already been struck. Back in the cabin, lunch service began. Samantha and Paula rolled the cart down the aisle, offering trays of grilled salmon or pasta primavera. When they reached Cathy, she took the salmon but asked for a second bread roll, preferably warm. When they reached Jordan, Samantha smiled. "Salmon or pasta?" "Please," Jordan said. Cathy glanced over just as Samantha placed the tray in front of him. "Make sure he gets the sparkling water," Cathy said, as if Jordan couldn't speak for himself. Jordan's eyes lifted, meeting hers. "I can order for myself," he said quietly. It wasn't rude, just firm. But Cathy's lips tightened as if she'd been challenged. "Of course," she replied, turning her attention back to her meal. Samantha moved on, but the tension lingered like a faint scent in the air. Half an hour later, with lunch finished and trays cleared, Jordan slipped his earbuds in and opened a playlist of classical piano music. He closed his eyes, trying to let the sound wash away the awkwardness of earlier. But he could still feel Cathy's presence like a shadow in the seat ahead of him. Samantha noticed too. As she walked past, she saw Cathy glance back at Jordan's row twice in less than a minute. It wasn't the casual glance of someone stretching their neck. It was deliberate. Paula caught her eye as they crossed in the aisle. Something Paula asked under her breath. "Not sure yet," Samantha replied. "But I don't like it." By the 2-hour mark, the cabin had settled into the quiet lull of mid-flight. Most passengers in first class were reading or dozing. The hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware filled the space. Samantha took a brief break in the galley, sipping water and leaning against the counter. She thought about Chloe, about the bills on her kitchen table, about how one long-haul trip could either feel like a safe harbor or a storm. This one felt like the sky was holding its breath. It happened just as she stepped back into the aisle. Cathy was speaking to Jordan again, her voice low but edged. "I just think," Cathy was saying, "that in first class, there should be an understanding of who belongs here. Not everyone appreciates the experience the same way." Jordan looked at her, his face calm. "I'm here because I have a ticket," he said. Her smile was thin. "Of course you are." Samantha approached before the exchange could go further. "Everything all right here?" Cathy turned the full force of her social smile on Samantha. "Perfectly fine. Just a little conversation." Jordan didn't say anything, but his eyes met Samantha's for a brief second. Enough for her to see that the conversation hadn't felt perfectly fine to him. She gave him a small nod, silent reassurance that she'd seen it, that it wasn't going unnoticed. In the cockpit, Marcus made another cabin check on the monitor. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw Jordan's posture, the slight stiffness in his shoulders. He told himself it was nothing. Passengers chatted, sometimes awkwardly. That was part of the job. Still, He made a note to check in with his son after they landed. For now, the spark between Cathy and Jordan smoldered quietly, unseen by most of the cabin. But Samantha knew the job well enough to recognize when a small friction had the potential to become something far more dangerous. She'd been through turbulence before, the kind the seatbelt sign warned about and the kind no captain's announcement could smooth over. This felt like the second kind. The flight had entered that long, steady stretch over the Midwest, where time seemed to slow. The seatbelt sign was off, and passengers moved quietly between their seats and the lavatory. The steady hum of the engines created a kind of white noise that made voices sound sharper when they cut through it. Jordan had closed his book and was scrolling through his tablet, reading an article on deep space exploration. He was so focused on the diagrams of exoplanets that at first he didn't notice Cathy shifting in her seat again. She turned halfway toward him, resting her elbow on the armrest as if settling into a casual conversation. "Do you travel first class often?" she asked. Her tone smooth, but with an undercurrent Jordan couldn't quite place. He looked up briefly. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Well, it's not like coach. You know, people up here usually value the quiet, the refinement of the space." Jordan frowned slightly. "I'm not being loud." "I didn't say you were," Cathy replied with a faint smile. "I just meant it's different up here. It's an environment some people take time to adjust to." Jordan didn't answer this time. His father had taught him that not every comment deserved a response. Samantha, coming up the aisle, with a tray of drinks for rows 4 and 5, caught enough of the exchange to feel her shoulders tighten. She made a mental note to circle back when she had a moment. Cathy leaned back slightly, sipping her wine. "I suppose it helps if you grow up in this kind of setting. Traveling this way from a young age makes it second nature." She let the words hang for a moment before adding, "Of course, not everyone does." Jordan's patience thinned. "My dad's a captain for this airline," he said. "I've been on flights my whole life." "Of course," Cathy said, her smile tightening. "That explains it." He wanted to ask what she meant by that, but something in her tone made him stop. The way she said "that explains it" felt like it carried more weight than the words alone. Paula stepped out from the galley then, offering Cathy a warm towel. "Everything all right up here?" she asked. "Perfectly fine," Cathy said in that same social smile. "We were just talking." Jordan didn't meet Paula's eyes, but she could sense he wasn't as fine as Cathy claimed. Back in the cockpit, Marcus made another sweep of the cabin camera feed. His son looked calm enough, but Marcus noticed the way Jordan's shoulders were pulled just slightly inward, a subtle defense posture. Marcus filed the observation away. 20 minutes later, Samantha began setting up for mid-flight snack service. She brought out small plates of fruit, cheese, and crackers, placing one on the console beside Cathy. "I asked for this without grapes," Cathy said, her voice even, but laced with disapproval. "My apologies," Samantha replied, picking up the plate. "I'll bring one without grapes right away." As Samantha turned, Cathy called after her, "Details matter, don't they? Especially in first class." Jordan caught the remark, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt like it wasn't just about the grapes. Samantha returned moments later with a plate of cheese and crackers, no grapes in sight. Cathy thanked her with a tight smile and turned her attention back to her tablet. Jordan took a sip of water, trying to focus on his music, but the tension was like static now, faint but present, making the air between rows 2 and 3 feel charged. When Cathy spoke again, it was quieter, almost like a test to see if Jordan would respond. "I hope you're enjoying the flight." she said without turning around. I am, Jordan replied, his voice neutral. That's good, she said. I imagine it must feel special for you. Jordan set his tablet down. Why would it feel more special for me than anyone else? She glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes cool. Oh, no reason. I just mean that opportunities like this don't come to everyone. Jordan didn't like the way she said opportunities. It was the same way some teachers at his old school had said it, the same way certain store clerks had when his dad took him shopping in places where they weren't used to seeing people like them. I have a ticket, he said, his voice steady but with a new firmness. I belong here. Cathy's lips parted, as if she might respond. But Samantha arrived at that moment with a trash bag, breaking the moment. Anything to clear? Samantha asked. Just this, Cathy said, handing over her napkin. She didn't look at Jordan again, but the slight stiffness in her posture made it clear the exchange had landed in the galley. Samantha took a slow breath. She'd seen this kind of thing before, conversations that looked harmless on the surface but carried sharp edges underneath. She had a growing sense that it was only a matter of time before those edges cut deeper. Meanwhile, Jordan slipped his earbuds back in, choosing a playlist of steady drum beats this time. He tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, grounding himself in the rhythm. From the cockpit, Marcus's voice came over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently cruising at 36,000 feet. Weather ahead looks clear, and we should be arriving in Los Angeles on schedule. We'll be dimming the cabin lights shortly for your comfort. Jordan smiled faintly at the sound of his father's voice. It was calm, confident, an anchor in the quiet storm he felt brewing behind him. As the lights dimmed, Cathy adjusted her seat and closed her eyes, but Jordan didn't believe for a second that this was over. People like her didn't let go of their unspoken judgments that easily. In the galley? Samantha poured herself a small cup of tea, leaning briefly against the counter. She thought about her own daughter, Chloe, and wondered how she'd feel if someone spoke to her in that same measured, undermining way. She knew the answer. It would set her blood boiling, but in uniform, she had to be careful, calm, professional, watching, waiting for the moment when her intervention might be necessary. The hum of the engines filled the space again, and for a while, the flight returned to quiet. But beneath it, 3 people in the front of the plane, Jordan, Samantha, and even Marcus in the cockpit, felt the same unspoken awareness. The air between rows 2 and 3 was no longer neutral. A line had been drawn, and everyone knew it, even if only one of them would admit it out loud. The cabin had quieted into that mid-flight stillness, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't feel entirely peaceful. It was too thin, too tight, as if it could shatter with the wrong word. Jordan kept his headphones in, eyes on the passing clouds, but he wasn't really listening to the music anymore. He was listening to the silence behind him, waiting for it to break. It did. You know, Cathy's voice came low and deliberate. My nephew is your age. When he travels with me, he knows how to sit still and not draw attention to himself. Jordan turned his head slightly. I'm not drawing attention to myself. She tilted her head, smiling faintly. Oh, I think you are. You've been fidgeting with that armrest for the last 20 minutes. And tapping, it's distracting. Jordan paused. He hadn't realized he'd been tapping, and even if he had, he doubted it was loud enough to carry. But her tone wasn't about tapping, it was about something else. I'll stop, he said simply, keeping his voice calm. That would be appreciated, Cathy replied. as if she were granting him a favor. From across the aisle. Samantha caught the exchange. She'd been in the middle of pouring coffee for another passenger, but her attention had locked on the words between Cathy and Jordan. She saw the stiffness in Jordan's posture, the slight drop of his gaze. Paul approached from the galley, sensing the change in the air. Samantha gave her a subtle shake of the head. "Don't intervene yet." But she stayed close. 15 minutes later, as Samantha collected empty glasses, she heard Cathy again. "I suppose the airline makes exceptions for the children of the crew," Cathy said. Her voice pitched just enough to be heard over the engine hum. "Though it does make you wonder about fairness, doesn't it?" Jordan didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead now, his fingers laced together in his lap. "Some people," Cathy continued, "save for years to sit in these seats. And then—" She trailed off, but the unfinished thought was obvious. Jordan's jaw tightened. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" Cathy smiled in a way that was almost gentle, but the words that followed were anything but. "I'm saying that sometimes the system puts people where they don't quite fit." Samantha set her tray down and stepped into the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" Cathy leaned back, wearing that same practiced smile. "Not at all. We're just talking." Jordan opened his mouth, but Samantha gave him a small shake of her head. She didn't want him to feel like he had to defend himself, not here. Not like this. Paula, now standing just behind Samantha, looked directly at Cathy. "If anything is making you uncomfortable, you can let us know. But I'd ask that we keep conversations respectful between passengers." "Of course," Cathy said smoothly. "Respect is important." Samantha knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who thought she'd just won something. She also knew it was far from over. In the cockpit, Marcus's focus was split between maintaining their cruising altitude and the slight knot forming in his stomach. He'd flown too many miles to ignore his instincts, and right now, they were telling him something was building in that cabin. Jordan sat still for the next half hour, saying nothing, doing nothing to give Cathy more reason to speak. But she didn't need a reason. People like her rarely did. When the seatbelt sign dinged on for mild turbulence, Samantha moved through the aisle, checking latches and securing loose items. As she passed Jordan's row, she saw Cathy lean toward him again. "You know, when I was your age, I knew how to respect my elders," Cathy said. Jordan turned to face her fully this time. His voice was quiet but steady. "Respect goes both ways." The woman's smile faltered. "Are you implying I've been disrespectful? I'm saying," Jordan replied, "that you've been talking to me like I don't belong here." "And I do." The exchange caught the attention of a businessman in 1B, who lowered his newspaper slightly. Another passenger in 4A glanced up from his laptop. The air in the cabin shifted, a subtle ripple as more ears tuned in. Samantha stepped forward, her voice firm but controlled. "All right, that's enough. Cathy, if you have any concerns about your seat or the service, you can speak with me or the lead flight attendant. But I need you to stop addressing other passengers in a way that makes them uncomfortable." "I'm not making anyone uncomfortable," Cathy said, her voice rising just slightly. "You're making me uncomfortable," Jordan said, the words landing with quiet weight. That silence after his statement felt like a held breath. Cathy looked around, as if expecting backup from other passengers, but none came. Paula appeared then, her tone calm but final. "Cathy, I'm going to ask you to refrain from speaking to this passenger for the remainder of the flight. If you can't agree to that, I'll have to involve the captain. Cathy's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. Fine. Samantha could see the way Jordan's shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way he'd let out a breath he'd been holding. Thank you, he said quietly to her as she moved past. She gave him a small smile. Any time. Back in the cockpit, Marcus noticed the slight shuffle of passengers visible on the cabin feed. He saw Samantha near Jordan's seat and caught a flash of Cathy's profile. It was enough to make him press the intercom button. Everything all right back there? He asked Paula through the crew channel. Handled for now, Paula replied, but I'll keep you updated. Marcus didn't like the answer, but he trusted her. Still, the protective part of him, the part that was both captain and father, was on alert now. The turbulence passed quickly, and the seatbelt sign switched off again. But the cabin wasn't the same. The quiet had shifted from tense to brittle, like glass that might crack at the lightest touch. Cathy stayed in her seat, scrolling on her phone, but every so often her gaze slid toward Jordan's row. Jordan returned to his book, but the words didn't stick in his mind. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, wondering if he'd said too much, or not enough. In the galley, Samantha poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. She thought of her daughter again, thought of the way Chloe's face lit up when she talked about her dreams. She thought about how she'd want someone to step in for Chloe if she were in Jordan's place. She'd stepped in today, but she had a feeling she wasn't done yet, because Cathy Whitmore didn't strike her as the kind of person who walked away from a perceived slight. And now, Jordan had drawn a line she might want to cross again. For almost an hour, Cathy kept to herself. At least, that was how it appeared to anyone glancing her way. She sipped her wine, scrolled through her phone, and occasionally glanced out the window at the endless stretch of sky. But Samantha had seen passengers like her before. The quiet was never real. It was a waiting game, a reset before the next move. Jordan tried to lose himself in a movie, something light and comedic, but his focus was fractured. Every time he saw Cathy shift in her seat or tilt her head in his direction, his muscles tensed. He didn't want to admit she was getting under his skin, but she was. Samantha walked through the aisle, checking on passengers, offering water. When she reached Jordan, she bent slightly, her voice low. You doing all right? He gave a small nod. Yeah. Her eyes said she didn't quite believe him, but she let it be. If anything changes, you call me over. All right. All right. Marcus kept one eye on the navigation display and the other on the subtle cues in his crew's voices when they checked in. He knew Paula and Samantha well enough to hear the threads of caution woven into their updates. In the cabin, the fragile calm began to crack when Samantha stepped into the galley to restock the beverage cart. She was gone less than 2 minutes, but when she returned, Cathy was leaning over the armrest, speaking directly to Jordan again. I just think, Cathy was saying, that some people don't understand how lucky they are. This isn't something you're entitled to. It's something you earn. Jordan's eyes narrowed. I didn't take anyone's seat. I belong here as much as you do. That's debatable, Cathy replied, her voice sharp enough that a passenger across the aisle glanced over. Samantha approached quickly. Cathy, we talked about this. I'm not doing anything, Cathy said, her tone defensive, but her eyes glittering with something else entirely. I'm having a conversation. Jordan spoke up, his voice quiet but unwavering. You're not having a conversation. You're trying to make me feel like I don't belong. The air between them felt charged. the kind of tension that draws every nearby ear whether they want to listen or not. Cathy straightened in her seat, then leaned back slowly, as if deciding something. You know what? Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. I'm sure one of the attendants could arrange that. Samantha's voice cut in. Firm. That's not going to happen. He has every right to be in his seat. This conversation is over. Cathy's lips tightened. For a moment, Samantha thought it might finally end. But then Cathy shifted again. Her movements sharper now, more pointed. Jordan was adjusting the volume on his tablet when Cathy's arms suddenly shot across the narrow space between their rows. She reached for the tablet screen, as if to pull it down. Maybe if you put this away, you could learn something about manners. Jordan flinched back instinctively, his hands coming up to protect the device. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, not enough to injure, but enough to cross a very clear line. Samantha was there in an instant, stepping between them. Cathy, that is enough. Her voice was low, but carried authority that froze half the passengers mid-motion. I didn't hurt him, Cathy said quickly, leaning back as if the space would protect her from the weight of the stairs now directed her way. You put your hands on another passenger, Samantha said. That is unacceptable. You will not speak to him or touch anything belonging to him for the rest of this flight. If you cannot agree to that, we will have to involve the captain immediately. The businessman in 1B cleared his throat, speaking up for the first time. I saw what happened. She reached over into his space. It wasn't an accident. That single witness shifted the mood in the cabin. Passengers who had been silent until now began to murmur, their expressions a mix of disapproval and curiosity. Cathy's cheeks flushed, but her chin lifted. This is ridiculous. It was a misunderstanding. Paula appeared behind Samantha, her presence solid and unyielding. Cathy, I'm marking this as a passenger interference incident. That means the captain will be notified. Jordan sat very still, his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. He wasn't scared, exactly, but the suddenness of her movement had rattled him. Samantha turned to him, softening her voice. You okay? Yeah, he said, though his voice was quieter than before. In the cockpit. Marcus received Paula's call. Her tone was clipped and professional, but the words were enough to make his jaw set hard. Passenger interference, physical contact, his son. He wanted to be in that cabin right now, but he couldn't leave the controls. Instead, he took a steadying breath and told Paula, do what you need to do to keep him safe. I'll be ready if you need me in person, back in first class. Cathy crossed her arms and stared straight ahead. She said nothing, but the rigid line of her posture spoke volumes. Samantha stayed close to Jordan's row for the next 20 minutes, intercepting any attempt at further contact. She offered Jordan a ginger ale and a cookie from the crew stash. He accepted both with a small smile, though the tension in his shoulders didn't fully ease. When Samantha stepped back into the galley, Paula joined her. She's not done, Paula murmured. I know, Samantha said, but the next move she makes, we'll be ready. And they both knew Cathy would make another move. People like her rarely stopped at one. The rest of the cabin tried to sink back into the calm of mid-flight. But the atmosphere had shifted. A single incident like that, especially one involving a young passenger, had a way of lingering in the air. Jordan put his headphones back on, not because he wanted to listen to music, but because it created a barrier, a signal that he wasn't open to conversation. Still, he could feel Cathy's presence. It was like a shadow just at the edge of his vision. And somewhere in the cockpit, his father was sitting in silence, replaying Paula's report, each word sharpening his awareness that this wasn't just a passenger incident. This was personal. The sky outside the windows remained clear, the kind of smooth blue that pilots love. But inside the cabin, the turbulence was just beginning. The cabin lights were dimmed for the evening stretch of the flight, casting a warm amber glow over the rows of first class. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic. But Samantha could feel the restless undercurrent in the air. Cathy sat with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead. But every so often her eyes flicked toward Jordan. It was the same pattern she had followed earlier, waiting, measuring, deciding. Jordan kept his headphones in, staring at the small screen in front of him. But Samantha had worked enough flights to know when someone was pretending to focus. His shoulders were stiff, his breaths a little too shallow. He was on alert, even if he didn't want to be. Paula passed quietly through the aisle, checking on passengers, her presence like a silent warning. Samantha followed a few steps behind, making sure to pause near Jordan's row. The hope was that Cathy would take the hint and let things be. It didn't work. When Samantha stepped away to answer a call light in row 5, Cathy leaned forward again, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the engine hum. "You really should thank me," she said to Jordan. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "For what?" "For teaching you how to behave in a place like this. Someone should, since clearly nobody else has." Jordan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond, but Cathy wasn't finished. "I've been watching you," she continued. "The fidgeting, the attitude. You're just proving my point. Some people can't handle being here." Jordan pulled out one earbud. "You don't know anything about me." Cathy gave a small, sharp laugh. "I know enough." Jordan was about to put his earbud back in when Cathy suddenly reached over again. This time not for his tablet, but toward the glass of water on his tray table. In one quick motion, she tipped it just enough for water to slosh across his lap. The shock of the cold made him gasp, and the movement caught Samantha's eye instantly from halfway up the aisle. She moved fast, arriving at his row in seconds. "What happened?" Samantha's voice was sharp, all professionalism stripped of its usual softness. "She spilled it on purpose," Jordan said, standing slightly to shake off the water. "That is not true," Cathy said quickly, but there was a faint smirk tugging at her lips, and it destroyed whatever credibility her denial might have carried. Samantha didn't look away from Cathy. "You have crossed the line. Stand up." Cathy blinked. "Oh, excuse me. Stand. Up," Samantha repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Passengers were watching now. A man in 2A leaned forward, and a woman in 3B whispered something to her seatmate. The cabin's attention was drawn like iron to a magnet. "I'm not moving," Cathy said, her voice tight. "I paid for this seat." Paula was there a moment later, stepping into the aisle like a wall. "Cathy, you are being relocated for the remainder of this flight. You can do it willingly, or I can have the captain authorize security to meet you at the gate." The smirk was gone now, replaced by a flush of anger. "This is harassment. This is enforcement of our safety policy," Paula said evenly. "Interfering with another passenger, especially a minor, is grounds for removal from your seat. Last chance." For a moment, it seemed like Cathy might comply. She gripped the armrest, eyes darting around the cabin, searching for support, but all she found were passengers watching silently, some with open disapproval. When she stood, it was with jerky, abrupt movements. As she stepped into the aisle, she turned toward Jordan, her voice low but cutting. "Remember this. You won't always have someone to hide behind. Samantha stepped directly between them. That's enough. Move. Paula led Cathy toward the back of the cabin, where an empty seat in premium economy had been prepared. Samantha stayed with Jordan for a moment, handing him a dry napkin and a fresh glass of water. You okay? She asked. He nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Yeah. You handled that well, she said. In the cockpit, Marcus had been patched into the crew channel for the last part of the exchange. Hearing the words relocating passenger was all it took to make his decision. He pressed the intercom to Paula. When she's seated, I want a full incident report ready before we land, he said. And Paula, I'll be making an announcement to the cabin. Yes, Captain, Paula replied. When she returned to the galley, Samantha joined her. You think she's done? Now Paula's eyes were hard. People like that, they're only done when they've convinced themselves they've won. She didn't win here. That's going to eat at her. The captain's voice came over the PA then, calm but carrying a subtle weight. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to remind everyone that this is a shared space, and our crew is here to ensure safety and respect for all passengers. Disrespect, harassment, or interference with another passenger will not be tolerated on this flight or any other. In 2B, Jordan sat a little taller. Hearing his father's voice, even without his name being mentioned, felt like a shield sliding into place. The rest of the first-class cabin was silent for several long moments after the announcement. Even the clink of ice and glasses seemed muted. In the back, Cathy sat stiffly in her new seat, her eyes fixed forward. But Samantha caught the occasional flicker of movement, her fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest, her jaw working as if she were rehearsing words for later. Jordan leaned his head back, closing his eyes. He wanted the flight to be over. He wanted to step off the plane and leave the tension behind. But somewhere deep down, he also knew Cathy wasn't finished. Paula and Samantha knew it too. And Marcus was already considering what steps he could take after landing, because he'd been in the air long enough to know that turbulence didn't always come from the weather. The engines kept their steady hum. The sky outside was as smooth as glass. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed completely. Every passenger could feel it, the sense that something significant had happened, and that the story of this flight wasn't anywhere near its last chapter. The hours after Cathy's relocation moved in slow, uneasy stretches. The warm lighting of the cabin could not disguise the shift in mood. Even passengers who had not been paying attention earlier now sat a little straighter, aware that the flight was carrying more than just people from one city to another. It was carrying tension. Jordan tried to focus on the movie again, but the images on the screen blurred. He was replaying every word Cathy had said to him, each one hitting harder in hindsight. He wondered if he should have answered differently, if silence would have made her stop sooner, or if speaking up had made it worse. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he already knew the truth. Cathy wasn't the kind of person who stopped because someone stayed quiet. In the galley, Samantha poured fresh coffee into a stainless steel carafe. Paula leaned against the counter, arms folded. She's stewing back there, Paula murmured. I know, Samantha replied. It's only a matter of time before she... The sound came before the sentence could finish. A raised voice, not loud enough to be shouting, but sharp enough to pierce the white noise of the engines. Both women moved instantly toward the back of the cabin. Passengers in rows 7 and 8 were turning in their seats. In the middle of the commotion sat Cathy, her expression animated and her hands gesturing wildly. This is outrageous, Cathy said, speaking to no one in particular and yet to everyone around her. I've been treated like a criminal for no reason. This is what happens when you let people in who don't know how to behave in first class. It ruins the entire experience for everyone. A couple in 8C and 8D exchanged an uncomfortable glance. A man in 9A muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Samantha stepped forward, keeping her voice even. Cathy, you need to lower your voice and refrain from making comments about other passengers. Cathy's gaze snapped to her. I'm telling the truth. That boy has no business up there. He was rude, entitled, and you're done. Paula interrupted, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. If you continue, the captain will come back here himself. And I promise you, you don't want that. Cathy laughed, but it wasn't a sound of amusement. Oh, please, what's he going to do? He's busy flying the plane. Samantha's eyes flicked to Paula. They had both heard enough. Paula reached for her crew phone and pressed the call button for the cockpit. Captain Ellison, she said when Marcus answered. I need you in the cabin. Now. There was a pause. The faint sound of the autopilot chime in the background. Then Marcus's voice, clipped and final. On my way. The cockpit door opened 2 minutes later, and Marcus stepped into the aisle. He wasn't wearing his captain's hat now, just the crisp uniform and the presence that came with decades of authority in the air. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. He walked down the aisle with calm, measured steps, stopping directly in front of Cathy's row. Ms. Whitmore, he said, his voice level. I understand there have been multiple incidents involving you and other passengers. This ends now. Cathy's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. You must be the captain. I'm glad you're here, because your crew has been completely unfair to me. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You interfered with a passenger. You made physical contact without consent, and now you're disturbing others. You will remain in this seat, silent, for the rest of the flight. If you do not, I will divert this aircraft and have you removed by authorities on the ground. The word authorities seemed to ripple through the nearby rows. A woman in 10B leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Marcus. This is absurd, Cathy said, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or nerves, it was hard to tell. You're making me out to be some kind of danger. Marcus didn't blink. You are a disruption, and disruptions endanger flights. I will not allow it to continue. Cathy opened her mouth as if to argue, but Marcus's steady gaze held her in place. It was the kind of look that came from a man who had guided hundreds of flights through storms and emergencies, who understood the weight of command. I suggest you think carefully before saying anything else, he said. Silence stretched for several seconds. Cathy finally looked away, her jaw tight. Marcus nodded once to Paula and Samantha. Resume service, he said, then turned to walk back toward the cockpit. But before he reached the front, a voice called after him. Wait. It was Cathy again. She had stood halfway up from her seat. Marcus stopped, but didn't turn. Sit down, he said, his tone sharper now. You can't talk to me like that, she said, her voice carrying. I know people. Important people. Slowly, Marcus turned to face her. So do I. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Neither of them would speak aloud. Cathy's lips parted, but whatever she had been about to say dissolved under the weight of the watching cabin. She sat back down, the movement abrupt. Marcus held her gaze for another heartbeat before walking away. When the cockpit door closed behind him, the cabin seemed to exhale. Jordan hadn't moved from his seat in first class, but he had heard every word, knowing his father had come back not as a pilot, but as his father sent a quiet strength through him. Samantha resumed her duties, but the awareness lingered in the air. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare, a captain leaving the cockpit mid-flight to personally address a passenger. Back in the galley, Paula shook her head. That should keep her quiet. Samantha wasn't so sure. Maybe. But people like her, they hate feeling powerless. And when they hate something, they find ways to get it back. Paula glanced toward the back of the cabin. Cathy sat motionless, staring out the window, but her reflection in the glass showed the tight curve of her mouth and the slight twitch of her fingers against the armrest. In the cockpit, Marcus checked the navigation screen, then glanced at the small cabin camera feed. He saw Jordan sitting still, headphones in, his face turned toward the window, and he saw Cathy's unmoving silhouette. It would be another 2 hours before they landed. In that time, anything could happen. And Marcus was ready for all of it. The cabin settled into a fragile quiet after Marcus returned to the cockpit. Fragile because it wasn't built on peace, only on the weight of his warning. It was the kind of stillness that could shatter with the smallest tap. Samantha moved through the aisle with the drink cart, keeping her expression neutral but her senses on high alert. She didn't look directly at Cathy as she passed her seat in the back of the cabin, but she felt the stare. It was the kind of gaze you could sense in your spine. Jordan sat in first class, eyes closed, earbuds in. But he wasn't listening to music. He was listening to the rhythm of the plane, the occasional clink of glassware, the shuffle of feet in the aisle. Every sound mattered now. Cathy sat rigid in her new seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had said nothing since Marcus's visit, but her silence was a coil wound too tight. Every so often she would take a deep breath, hold it, and let it out slowly, like someone trying to keep control of something already slipping. Half an hour passed this way. Passengers began to believe the worst was over. Paula even allowed herself to focus on paperwork in the galley, signing off on supply counts and logging minor maintenance notes. Samantha poured tea for a passenger in row 3, telling herself to keep moving forward, to not linger in the shadow of what had happened. Then it happened. A sudden, sharp noise tore through the air, a metallic clatter, followed by a gasp. Samantha spun around toward the back of the cabin. Cathy was on her feet. Her tray table hung down, a glass rolling across it before falling to the floor. She was moving fast, much faster than anyone expected. Before Samantha could reach her, Cathy had pushed into the aisle and was striding toward first class. Passengers' heads turned like a wave following her progress. The murmurs began instantly, the low sound of collective disbelief. Paula's voice came over the crew intercom, urgent. "Samantha, stop her!" Samantha moved quickly, but Cathy had already crossed the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. She headed straight for Jordan's row. Jordan opened his eyes just in time to see her coming. He pulled out one earbud, confusion flickering across his face. But before he could finish, Cathy reached his seat. Her voice was sharp, almost trembling. "You think you can hide behind your father's uniform, but you can't." "Ma'am, step away," Samantha said, closing the distance fast. Cathy leaned down, too close now, invading Jordan's space. "You're nothing but a spoiled—" The sentence never finished. In one swift, ugly motion, Cathy's hand came up and slapped Jordan across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin like a snapped branch. Gasps erupted from every direction. A man in 2A stood up halfway, his eyes wide. A woman in 1C clapped her hand over her mouth. Samantha grabbed Cathy's arm instantly, pulling her back. "That's it. You're done." Jordan sat frozen for a second, the sting on his cheek blooming hot. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. His breathing was fast, but his eyes were locked on Cathy with a kind of stunned disbelief. Passengers were shouting now, voices overlapping. She hit him. "Did you see that unbelievable?" Paula appeared from the galley, her presence like a sudden storm. "Cathy Whitmore, you are under cabin arrest for the remainder of this flight. Sit down now." "I was defending myself," Cathy said, trying to pull away from Samantha's grip. "You walked from the back of the plane to hit a passenger," Paula said, her voice like ice. "There is no defense for that." The cockpit door opened again. Marcus stepped out, his eyes sweeping the cabin in one hard glance before locking on Jordan. "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Jordan shook his head, but the redness on his cheek said otherwise. Marcus turned to Cathy. "You just assaulted my son." The collective realization moved through the cabin like a current, passengers putting the pieces together, understanding why the captain had come back earlier, why the tension had been so sharp. Cathy's face went pale. "I didn't know." "It doesn't matter who he is," Marcus said, cutting her off. "You assaulted a minor. On my aircraft. For the first time." Cathy's composure faltered completely. He was disrespectful." Marcus stepped closer, his voice still calm, but every word carrying weight. "You will remain seated in the jump seat at the rear of the aircraft. You will be restrained if you do not comply. And when we land, law enforcement will meet you at the gate." The murmurs in the cabin rose again, but this time they were edged with approval. Passengers leaned back, nodding slightly, as if they too had been waiting for this moment of accountability. Paula guided Cathy toward the back, her grip firm on the woman's elbow. Samantha stayed with Jordan, kneeling beside his seat. "You okay?" Jordan nodded again. "Slower this time?" "Yeah." His voice was steadier now, but his eyes still held the shock of what had happened. Marcus crouched beside him for a moment, his voice low enough for only Jordan to hear. "She won't touch you again." Jordan managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes yet. "I know." Marcus stood, addressing the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance you just witnessed. This crew will continue to ensure your safety and comfort for the remainder of the flight. Thank you for your cooperation." The cockpit door closed behind him once more, but the echoes of what had happened lingered. Passengers whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, others glancing at Jordan with sympathy. In the rear jump seat, Cathy sat rigid, staring straight ahead. The restraint belt was fastened across her lap, and Paula stood close enough to ensure she wouldn't move. Samantha resumed her rounds, but she kept circling back to Jordan's row. Each time, she found him sitting a little straighter, the color in his face returning. The rest of the flight would be quiet, but not restful. Too much had happened, and for Marcus, the landing would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something else, something that reached far beyond this single flight. The engines droned on, steady as ever, carrying everyone closer to a destination none of them had expected. The silence after the slap was like the sky before a storm too still, too loaded. Everyone in first class had witnessed it, and the energy was different now. Conversations were hushed, movements deliberate, as if the entire cabin was treading lightly around an invisible fracture. Jordan sat back against the leather seat, trying to relax his shoulders. His cheeks still held a faint warmth from Cathy's hand, but more than the sting, it was the fact that she had done it at all that lingered. He stared out the window at the clouds rushing past, his mind replaying the moment in slow motion. Samantha checked on him again, bringing a fresh towel and a cold bottle of water. She didn't say much, just placed them within his reach and gave a small nod. Jordan appreciated that. Too many words would have made it worse. In the back of the cabin, Cathy was a study in stillness. Paula stood only a few feet away, her arms crossed, eyes sharp. Cathy kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, but every so often her jaw moved as if she were grinding her teeth. She had stopped speaking completely, and in some ways, that made her more dangerous. Up in the cockpit, Marcus adjusted the autopilot. His focus split between the navigation readouts and the mental checklist of what would happen when they landed. Assaulting a passenger, especially a minor, meant Cathy would be met by airport security. There would be statements to file, possibly charges. He knew the process inside and out. But this wasn't just any passenger. This was his son. He pressed the intercom. Lid flight attendant to cockpit. Paula arrived a minute later, her posture as steady as always. She's not moving. I've got her restrained in the jump seat, and I'll keep her there until we taxi to the gate. Good, Marcus said. I'm making an announcement in a few minutes. I want the cabin still when I do it. No one moving around, no carts in the aisle. Paula's eyes narrowed slightly. You're going to address her directly, aren't you? I'm going to address everyone, Marcus said. But yes, she'll know it's about her. Paula gave a small nod and returned to the cabin. Samantha, sensing something was about to happen, began quietly wrapping up drink service. She collected empty glasses and tucked them into the cart, moving with calm precision. In first class, a few passengers leaned toward the aisle, curious. Then Marcus's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'd like to take a moment to address the events some of you may have witnessed earlier. This aircraft is not just a mode of transportation. It is a shared space, a temporary community in which safety and respect are non-negotiable. Every passenger, regardless of who they are, where they're from, or what seat they're in, has the right to complete their journey without fear of harassment or harm. The cabin was silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. It is my duty to protect that right, Marcus continued, and I will not hesitate to act when it is threatened. Any violation of that principle will be met with immediate and decisive action. That includes today, and it will include every flight I ever command. I appreciate your cooperation in helping us maintain an environment of safety and respect for all. He clicked off the intercom. The weight of his words settled over the passengers. A man in 2A nodded slowly. A woman in 3C looked toward Jordan with open sympathy, even in the back. Some passengers glanced at Cathy, their expressions cold. Cathy's face flushed. She shifted in her seat, her hands gripping the restraint belt tighter. She knew the captain's words were aimed at her, but there was no way to argue without making things worse. Paula stayed near her, watching for any sudden movement. In first class. Jordan let out a slow breath. He could feel the difference. Before, Cathy's aggression had been a personal attack. Now, it was a violation the captain had called out in front of everyone. She wasn't just a problem to him anymore. She was a problem to the entire flight. Samantha checked on him once more, this time crouching down so they were eye level. We'll be landing soon, she said softly. When we do, you stay seated until I tell you it's okay to get up. All right, Jordan said. An hour from landing. The cabin lights dimmed for descent preparation. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening belts, sliding window shades down. But the quiet held, the kind of quiet that had been forged through shared tension. Marcus monitored the weather at their destination. Clear skies, smooth approach. But in his mind, he was already running through the post-landing sequence. Airport security would be waiting, statements would be taken, and the airline's corporate team would hear about this incident before the day was over. In the back, Cathy finally broke her silence. "This is going to be a mistake you regret," she said to Paula in a low voice. Paula didn't look at her. "The only mistake was yours." "You don't know who I am," Cathy said. Paula's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "I don't need to. I know what you did." Cathy's hands clenched, the knuckles white, but she said nothing else. As the seatbelt sign came on, Marcus's voice returned to the cabin. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The words were routine, but in this case, they carried a finality everyone could feel. Whatever had happened on this flight would end when the wheels touched the ground. But the consequences were just beginning. Jordan stared out the window again, watching the thin line of the horizon rise toward them. His cheek no longer hurt, but he knew the memory of this flight would stay with him. Not as fear, Marcus had made sure of that, but as a reminder of how quickly people's masks could slip. Samantha moved through the aisle one last time, checking belts and tray tables. She paused at Jordan's row, giving him a quiet thumbs up before continuing. The aircraft began its gradual descent. The engines shifted pitch, the cabin tilted slightly forward, and the faint vibration of the landing gear lowering could be felt through the floor. In the back, Cathy kept her eyes closed, as if she could will herself somewhere else. But the moment the seatbelt sign chimed off after landing, she would have to face what was waiting. Marcus kept his hands steady on the controls, guiding the plane with the same calm precision he had shown all day. But inside, a different energy burned, a resolve that this incident would not fade quietly into the logs of minor in-flight disturbances. The wheels met the runway with a firm thud. The reverse thrusters roared, then eased, the aircraft slowing as the runway lights flashed by. The flight was over. The aftermath was about to begin. The tires kissed the runway with a smooth, confident landing. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the cabin, but the quiet was heavy. Everyone knew this flight wasn't over, not really. The engines hummed in deceleration as the plane rolled toward its gate, the runway lights blinking past like watchful eyes. Jordan sat upright, his belt snug across his lap. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The awareness of Cathy's presence behind him was enough. Samantha stood in the forward galley, her hand resting on the door handle, already in professional mode, ready for the ground crew. In the back, Paula stayed planted next to Cathy, who kept her eyes forward, jaw locked. She was still, but it was the brittle stillness of someone holding herself together by threads. Paula had seen it before people who realized too late that their sense of power didn't extend beyond the sealed cabin door. Marcus guided the aircraft smoothly into the gate. The jet bridge began its slow extension toward the forward door, the hydraulic hiss echoing faintly into the cabin. He unbuckled, stood, and adjusted his uniform jacket. This part was no longer about piloting, it was about command. The chime sounded, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Law enforcement will be boarding shortly for a matter concerning one of our passengers. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." Heads turned. Whispers flared again, but there was no mistaking the authority in Marcus's tone. The sign above flicked off, but still no one moved. The forward door opened, and 2 airport police officers stepped on board, flanked by a security agent from the airline. The officers carried the calm, deliberate posture of men who had done this before. Paula caught Marcus's eye from the rear of the cabin. gave a sharp nod, and gestured to Cathy. "She's the one." Cathy looked up, her voice catching. "This is ridiculous. I didn't." "You're being detained for questioning regarding an in-flight assault," the taller officer said. "Please come with us." "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to my attorney," Cathy shot back, her voice rising. "You can make that call once we're off the aircraft," the officer said evenly. Passengers were leaning into the aisle now, some with phones discreetly lifted, recording. Cathy's face flushed deeper. She stood reluctantly, brushing her designer jacket as if the act might restore some sense of dignity. As she was escorted down the aisle, a woman in 3B murmured, "About time." A man in 2D shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." When Cathy reached the front, she caught sight of Jordan. For a moment, her expression softened, as if she might say something. But Marcus stepped between them. "Keep moving," he told her. The officers led her off the plane, her heels clicking sharply against the jet bridge floor. In the sudden stillness that followed, Marcus turned to the passengers in first class. "Thank you for your understanding," he said simply, then stepped aside for them to begin deplaning. Jordan waited until the cabin had emptied before unbuckling. Samantha stayed with him, helping him collect his bag from the overhead bin. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You did great, kid." He managed a nod. "Thanks for looking out for me. That's what we're here for," she said, and she meant it. When Jordan stepped onto the jet bridge, Marcus was waiting. He put a hand on his son's shoulder, steering him toward the private corridor that led to the crew lounge. They passed a glass wall where Cathy stood surrounded by officers, talking rapidly into her phone. Marcus didn't slow, didn't look at her. In the lounge, away from the noise, Marcus finally stopped. "You okay?" he asked, studying his son's face. Jordan hesitated. "Yeah. I mean, it's weird. She just lost it." Marcus nodded. "People like that, they don't see you. They see what they want to see. And when reality doesn't match, they lash out." Jordan frowned. "So what happens to her now?" "She'll deal with the consequences," Marcus said. "But that's not our job to handle anymore. Our job is to move forward." Jordan was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to come out of the cockpit earlier." "But you did." Marcus's expression softened. "Flying the plane is my job. Protecting you is my life." Jordan looked away, blinking quickly. He wasn't used to his father saying things like that out loud. Samantha poked her head into the lounge. "Security says they're taking her downtown. Paul is finishing the incident report. They'll need you for a quick statement before you go." Marcus nodded. "We'll be there in a minute." When she left, Jordan let out a breath. "I guess this flight is going to be hard to forget." Marcus gave a small smile. "Some flights change your destination in ways you don't see on a map." Outside in the terminal, passengers who had witnessed the slap were already talking, some still filming short clips to send to friends or post online. By the time Marcus and Jordan walked out, snippets of the incident were already circulating grainy phone footage of Cathy being escorted off, Marcus standing in uniform, the murmured commentary of shocked onlookers. But Marcus didn't think about the viral potential. He thought about the message. In a world where first impressions and quick judgments could spark dangerous confrontations, standing up for respect and dignity wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. As they walked toward the exit, Jordan glanced up at him. "So, dinner before we head home." Marcus smiled. "Dinner sounds perfect." They stepped into the cool night air outside the terminal, leaving behind the bright glare of the jet bridge and the shadows of the flight that had started as routine but ended as a quiet stand for something bigger. For Marcus, the flight would live in his logbook like any other, recorded with time, route, and conditions. But in his mind, it was written differently, not as a flight from point A to point B, but as a reminder to his crew, his passengers, and especially his son, that leadership isn't always about steering a plane through the clouds. Sometimes, it's about facing the turbulence inside the cabin and holding your course until the skies are clear again. Some moments stay with you long after the engines go quiet. This flight was one of them. Jordan Ellison will remember the sting of that slap, but more importantly, he will remember his father stepping into the cabin not as a pilot, but as a protector. Marcus Ellison reminded everyone that titles, money, and status mean nothing without respect for others. We saw how a single act of prejudice can ripple through a space, infecting the air, and how one person's courage can clear it. And while justice was served for one passenger, the larger truth remains: discrimination has no place in the skies or anywhere else. Let this story be a reminder: strength is not always loud, and dignity is not always easy. Sometimes the most powerful stand you can take is the one that refuses to lower itself to the level of hate. If this story touched you, share it. If it made you think, talk about it. And if you believe we need more voices against injustice, join us here. Like, share, and subscribe, so you'll be with us for the next story, because every flight, every seat, and every passenger deserves respect.